The water was still warm from the afternoon when I realized the ferry wasn't coming back. I'd been standing on the government dock at Rock Harbor for 40 minutes by then, and I'd fallen into that habit a man gets when he's waiting on something that's late counting the seconds between the waves that came in and slapped the pilings under my feet. There's a rhythm to Lake Superior when the weather's calm, a long, slow breathing in and out. And I knew that rhythm the way you know the sound of your own furnace kicking on at night. That afternoon, the rhythm was fine. The waves were fine. It was the horizon that was wrong, not the waves, the absence. On a normal run, the ferry, the Ranger 3, 112 feet of white-hulled Park Service steel, shows up on the eastern horizon like a thumbnail held at arm's length. And for the last 20 minutes of her approach, you get to watch her grow. That's the part I always liked. You see the white shape first, then the black waterline under it, then the wheelhouse, and somewhere in there, you stop seeing her and start hearing her. The low diesel drone carrying flat across the water long before she's close enough to wave at. It's one of the most dependable things I know. The arrival of that boat. You could set a watch by it. Men have. That afternoon, there was nothing on the water at all. Just a haze the color of dishwater hanging low where the sky met the lake, and under the haze, the lake itself. Gray and flat and enormous. Going out past the edge of everything. I want you to hold on to one number about that water, because it shaped every decision I made for the next 3 days. Off that shore, Lake Superior runs better than 300 feet deep. And in July, under a warm sky, 30 feet down, it's still cold enough to stop a grown man's heart inside a minute. The surface can fool you. The surface was warm. Everything under it wanted to kill you. My name is Errol Vantine. I'm 49 years old. For 11 years, I ran contract medical deliveries for the National Park Service out of Houghton, Michigan, the cold cargo mostly. Insulin, antivenin, the refrigerated cases that nobody trusts to a summer intern with a cooler and good intentions. I'm the man they call when a shipment has a temperature range printed on the side of it, and a human being's life sitting inside that range. That day, I had 6 coolers strapped down onto a 2-wheel handcart, packed in dry ice, each one taped and labeled and cold to the touch through the insulation. Vaccine. Addressed to the seasonal clinic at Rock Harbor, and to the ranger station at Windigo, 40 miles to the west at the other end of the island. Routine. I'd made that crossing maybe 200 times, and 200 times the ferry had come back. The 2-way radio in my hand had gone to static about an hour before. I'd been thumbing the volume up and down out of nervousness, the way you do. And the last thing I'd heard from the mainland, from a dispatcher named Colleen, whose voice I'd known for years without ever putting a face to it, was, "Errol, hold position, do not," and then a sound. I've tried 100 ways to describe that sound. The closest I've got is a heavy door being kicked in that flat wooden crack, and behind it, something falling. And then nothing. Not silence, static. The channel was still open. Colleen just wasn't on it anymore. I want to say something before I take you all the way into this. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to sit with these stories. And if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm genuinely glad you found us. If grounded survival stories like this one are your kind of thing, stay with the channel and leave a comment when something gets under your skin. Now let me tell you what I found when I finally stopped watching the empty horizon and turned around and looked at the island behind me. There were people on the dock road, maybe 9 of them, though I didn't count right away because counting wasn't the first thing my brain did. The first thing my brain did was register the way they moved, because it moved in that loose, scattered way you see when a crowd hasn't figured out yet that it's a crowd, no one leading, no one following, everyone drifting on the same current for reasons none of them could have told you. There were tourists in the bright rain shells everybody buys at the lodge store. There was a ranger in Park Service green, an older couple in matching windbreakers, and all of them were walking down the gravel road toward the water, toward me, at the same slow, patient pace. And not one single one of them was looking at the lake. That was the detail that turned my stomach cold before I understood any of the rest of it. People come to the water. When you're standing on a dock, people who come down the dock road look at the water, at the boats, at the horizon. They look at the thing that everyone comes to that place to look at. These 9 looked at nothing. Or rather, I realized as they came on. They looked at me. Not with their eyes exactly, with their whole bodies, the way a compass needle looks north. Isle Royale is the loneliest place in the lower 48. And I need you to understand that, because the loneliness is the reason nobody was coming for me. It's a 45-mile spine of rock and boreal forest lying in the top of Lake Superior, closer to the Canadian shore than to the Michigan one. And it has no roads, no cars, no cell towers, no power grid coming in from anywhere, no year-round human beings at all. In winter, they actually close it, October to April, when the storms come down out of Canada and the lake tries to freeze and doesn't quite manage it. And for 6 months, there is not one living person on that whole island. Only the wolves, and the moose they hunt, and the wind, which on Isle Royale in January is a living thing with opinions. In summer, maybe a few hundred backpackers, spread across 130,000 acres of forest and ridge and inland lake. You do not go to Isle Royale to be found. That's the whole point of the place. You go there to disappear on purpose for a week, with a canoe and a permit and 40 pounds of freeze-dried food, and the park is designed around that disappearance, which meant that on the afternoon the ferry didn't come back. My real problem was never the sick people on the dock road, terrible as they were. My real problem was arithmetic. The park runs on a schedule you can measure in hours. If the Ranger 3 missed her return, the next scheduled vessel was the Voyageur 2, a smaller boat that worked the north shore of the island, and she wasn't due for 2 days. There was a float plane out of Houghton, but it flew on demand. Somebody had to pick up a telephone and call it. And the last person I knew of who could pick up that telephone was named Colleen. And the last thing Colleen ever said to me got cut off by the sound of a door coming apart. So there was no cavalry. There was no version of that afternoon where a boat rounded the point and everything went back to being ordinary. There was only the island and the water and me and whatever I decided to do in the next couple of minutes. The people on the dock road were about 200 yards out when I understood they were sick. You know it before you can put a name to it. That's the thing nobody tells you. Your body knows before your mind agrees. The gait was the first wrongness. Not a stagger exactly. Something worse than a stagger. Because a stagger has a reason. A stagger is a man who's had too much or turned an ankle. This was a smooth, forward-leaning drift. Every one of them tilted a few degrees off vertical toward whatever they were walking at, as if each of them had a fishhook set behind the breastbone and a line drawing them in. A woman in a yellow rain poncho kept walking into the low split-rail fence that ran along the path. Hit it at the hip. The impact turned her a little. She corrected, drifted on, and hit it again 3 steps later at the same spot. And nobody around her so much as glanced her way. On a normal day, a woman walking into a fence draws help. Somebody takes her elbow. These people had gone past helping each other. They had gone past knowing each other was there. There was a man in the group wearing the green Park Service uniform, and down the front of his shirt he had blood not sprayed, not in a wound pattern, but a wide, dark bib of it, soaked from the collar down, the shape blood makes when it comes out of the mouth. His jaw was moving, opening and closing, working steadily on nothing at all, like a man chewing a word he could feel in his mouth but couldn't finish saying. I did what any sane man standing on a dock does when the situation on land goes wrong. I looked for the boat. I turned back to the water and I searched that dishwater horizon for the white thumbnail that always came. And it wasn't there. And I knew for certain in that moment that it wasn't coming, and that I was going to have to solve this myself with what was in reach. So I made myself think. I had a hand cart with 6 coolers of vaccine, a dead radio, and maybe 90 seconds of clean thinking before those 9 people closed the distance. And I spent the 90 seconds the way I'd been trained to spend a bad 90 seconds, which is on geography. The dock at Rock Harbor is a long timber finger reaching out into a sheltered channel. Behind it, up a short rise, sits the Rock Harbor Lodge, a low huddle of buildings, a store, a dining hall, guest cabins scattered up the slope under the spruce. To the east, hiking trails climbing into the interior. To the west, the water route that runs the length of the island to Windigo. And there is exactly one way off that dock on foot, and it runs directly up the gravel road, straight through the middle of the 9 people who were coming down it. So I went the other way. Not into the water onto it. There's a dockside rack at the lodge where they keep the aluminum canoes and kayaks they rent to guests, chained through the seat frames with a cable. No good to me. I didn't have a key or time to find one. But tied off at the very end of the dock, riding low and long and dark green against the pilings, was a Park Service utility skiff, 16 feet of aluminum with a small outboard hung off the transom, the kind of workboat the trail crews use to shuttle lumber and tools between the backcountry campgrounds. It was tied there for the Ranger 3's deck crew, most likely, waiting to haul something up the channel once she docked. But the Ranger 3 hadn't docked, and there was no crew, and there was a boat. I threw the ratchet straps off the handcart. And here's the thing I keep circling back to, months later, in the dark, when I can't sleep. With 9 sick human beings drifting down a gravel road toward me, my very first clear physical decision was to move the coolers. I picked up the first one cold through the shell, heavier than it looked with the dry ice in it, and I set it down in the bottom of that skiff. And then the second, and the third, and I loaded all 6 coolers of vaccine into the boat before I ever loaded myself. It felt, right then, like the only professional act left in a world that had stopped making sense. I was a courier. The cargo was the point of me. If everything else was coming apart, then the one thing I could still do correctly, the one thing that was still true about who I was to protect the load and deliver it. I told myself that, working fast, the straps loose in my hands, I would learn over the next 3 days exactly what those 6 coolers were worth and exactly to whom, and that knowledge would cost me more than the crossing ever should have. The outboard was a pull start. First pull, it coughed and died. My hands weren't steady, and I made myself slow them down, set the choke, brace my knee against the transom, and the second pull it caught and held. And the sound of that little engine turning over was, for about 1 full second, the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. For 1 second. Because the woman in the yellow poncho had reached the head of the dock by then, out on the boards, maybe 40 yards off. And the instant the motor barked to life, she turned toward the sound and turned with her whole body at once, faster than her walk had been by a wide margin, a snap of movement that had nothing sick or slow in it at all. And the others turned with her, all of them, together, like iron filings when you slide a magnet under the paper. And that was the moment I understood the first true thing about them. which was that the drift was only their resting state. The sound woke something else up. Noise was the trigger. Noise was the fishhook. I opened the throttle, and I put water between us. The channel that leads out of Rock Harbor is narrow and deep and green, walled on both sides by wet gray rock and dark spruce that comes right down to the waterline. And it bends within the first quarter mile so that you lose sight of the dock behind the trees almost at once. I remember the relief of that bend, the physical relief of it. The way my shoulders came down from around my ears when the lodge and the dock and the 9 turned faces slid out of sight behind the rock. The engine noise flattened out and spread over the open water. The wake unrolled behind me, white on green. For about a minute, I let myself believe I had gotten clear of the worst part of the day. Then I came around the point into the wider channel, and I saw the Ranger 3. And the worst part of the day was just starting. She was aground. The big ferry, all 112 feet of her, was run up hard on the rocks of a little island in the middle of the passage, heeled over maybe 15 degrees so her white flank leaned toward me, and her bow was crumpled and folded back where she'd struck. Steel doesn't crumple quietly. Whatever had happened there had happened at speed. Her lifeboats were still hanging in their davits, untouched, which told its own story. Nobody had had the time or the order or the presence of mind to launch a boat. Her boarding gangway was down and lay half in the water off the low side, and the water around her lower deck, in the long shadow of her hull, was moving. I cut the throttle back and let the skiff coast, the engine burbling at idle. And I made myself look at that ship for a long time and see it clearly. I've found in my life that the only thing worse than a bad situation is a bad situation you won't let yourself measure. So I measured it. There were people on the Ranger 3. Some of them were moving along the tilted deck in that same hooked drift I'd seen on the road, bumping into the high rail and turning and drifting back, going nowhere, a slow, terrible pacing. But others weren't moving at all. They were arranged up along the high side of the list, sitting, wedged into the angles where deck met bulkhead, tucked into corners as far from the drifting ones as the geometry allowed. And even from 60 yards out, I could tell that some of those still ones were alive. Because when my engine noise carried across the water to them, they lifted their heads. And I could tell that some of them were sick, because they lifted their heads too, but too fast, all at once, snapping toward the sound the way the poncho woman had snapped, and then holding, fixed on me, while the living ones only turned and looked and went still again, with the particular stillness of people trying very hard not to draw attention. And one of them was waving. Not the sick snap, a real wave, a frightened, deliberate, both arms over the head human wave. From the wheelhouse door, high up on the tilted superstructure, up and away from all the rest of them. A man, waving at me and not making a sound. And I understood the silence of that wave, understood it in my gut. He wanted me to see him. He did not want the others to hear him. Now I want you to sit inside the decision I was inside of, because I've told this part to people since, and some of them tell me easily what they would have done. And easy is the one thing that decision never was. I had 6 coolers of vaccine that somebody somewhere needed badly enough to run a special delivery to the end of the earth. I had a full fuel tank and 1 spare gallon can lashed under the bow seat. I had 40 miles of open lake between me and the only other station on the island, and no way on God's earth to know whether that station was any better off than this one. Every soul I took into that skiff was weight the boat would have to carry and noise the sick things would hear, and 1 more body between me and the vaccine's safe arrival. And I did not yet know this is the part that mattered most, and that I had no way to answer how the sickness moved from one person to the next. Was it the air, the water, Touch? A bite? I didn't know. Taking 4 strangers aboard a boat 16 feet long, when you don't know how the thing spreads, is not a small risk. It might be the last risk you ever take. But there was a man in a wheelhouse waving both his arms at me in silence, choosing not to shout because shouting would kill him. And I am simply not built to motor past that. I never have been. It's not a virtue. It might be the opposite of a virtue, given how it turned out. But it's the truth of me, and it decided the next 3 days. I brought the skiff around the stern of the ferry, keeping to the low side where the list leaned the hull away from the drifting ones up top. And I called up as quietly as I could and still carry, "How many with you? And is anyone bitten?" His answer told me most of what I'd need to survive the coming days, though I didn't know it yet. He called down, low and fast. 4 of us, nobody's bitten. We locked the door. And before I could feel even a flicker of relief at nobody's bitten, a second voice came from behind him, a woman's. Sharp and hard and considerably older, cutting across his like a boat hook. "Don't tell him about the crew. Get us off this boat first." The wheelhouse of a grounded ferry is a hard thing to reach from a 16-foot skiff riding at the waterline, but the list worked in our favor. The Ranger 3 had heeled toward me, so her high side hung out over the water like a wall in the slow act of falling. And down from a cleat near the stern rail, somebody had lowered a boarding ladder, one of those hinged aluminum jobs the crew uses for inspecting the hull at the dock. And its bottom rungs were in the water. Whoever had rigged it had done it deliberately and recently, and with a cool head. That told me something good about at least one of the 4. They came down that ladder to me one at a time, and I'm going to name each of them the way I came to know them. Because by the end, every name carried a different weight in my hand. The first down was the man who'd waved, Del Sorensen. The Ranger 3's deckhand, maybe 30 years old, wiry and quick, with a shiny old burn scar running up the inside of one forearm. And the kind of competence that shows first in a man's feet. He came down a swaying ladder into a rocking aluminum boat and stepped to the center line and sat. And he never once grabbed at me for balance, never put a hand where a hand shouldn't go on a small boat. I trusted his hands before I trusted anything else about him. And I was right to. Second came the owner of the hard voice, Francis Okafor. 61, I'd learned. A retired charter captain out of Duluth who'd been aboard the ferry as an ordinary paying passenger and who had, somewhere in the chaos of the crossing, appointed herself the person in charge, which I mistook at first for arrogance, and came to understand was nothing of the kind. It was 40 years of habit. Some people, when the world tips over, reach for something to hold. Frances reached for the wheel. She came down the ladder slower than Del, deliberate, testing each rung. A heavy-set woman moving with the economy of someone who has spent a lifetime not falling off of boats. Third was a boy, a young man, I should say. But he had the soft, unfinished look of 19, and the fear of a much younger person all over him. Theodore Wyss, a lodge kitchen worker, over on a summer work visa from somewhere in Eastern Europe that I never did ask him to name, because it stopped mattering. He came down that ladder, shaking so hard the aluminum rattled. And when his foot found the gunwale of the skiff, he froze, unable to make the last step. And it was Del who reached up and took his wrist and guided him down. And Theodore sat in the bottom of the boat among the coolers and wrapped his arms around his knees and did not say one word for the first full hour we were on the water. The fourth was the one I should have watched. Bram Callister, a big, soft-shouldered man in his mid-40s, dressed in good outdoor gear, the kind that costs real money. The technical fabrics, the boots that were broken in but not beaten up. He came down the ladder last and slowest, and not because he was afraid the way Theodore was afraid. He came down slow the way a man moves when he's thinking about something other than the ladder. And the first thing he did when his feet touched the bottom of my skiff was turn around, reach back up, and work the aluminum ladder free of its cleat so that it fell away from the hull and splashed into the channel and drifted off on the current, out of reach. "So, nothing follows us down," he said. And it was reasonable. It was smart even. I remember thinking, here's a man who thinks ahead. I've spent a great deal of time since then on the difference between a man who thinks ahead and a man who thinks only ahead. A man who plans for everyone, and a man who plans only for himself and lets you believe you're included. And I've come to understand how long it can take to tell those two men apart, and how much that time can cost the people who guess wrong. We were 5 people now, and 6 coolers, in a 16-foot aluminum skiff built to haul lumber, riding low enough that I could reach over the side and touch the water without leaning. The lake was flat, but I've told you already the lake is never really flat, and I had 40 miles of it to cross to reach Windigo, and the light was already going long and gold in the west, which was the direction I had to run. Frances did the talking, because Frances always did the talking. And in the first 10 minutes on the water, she gave me the shape of what had happened aboard that ferry. And it was worse than a grounding. The Ranger 3 had cast off from Windigo that morning on her regular run, and Windigo to Rock Harbor by water is a long way, hours of it, around the whole east end of the island. Somewhere out in the middle of the crossing, a passenger had gotten sick. Not seasick, Frances said, and she said it flat, the way you'd report a barometer reading. Sick. She'd been fine at the dock. Ate breakfast in the galley. I watched her do it. Inside of an hour, she'd gone gray, and she was sweating through her shirt. And then she started biting. That was the word she used. Biting. No drama in it. Just the fact. The crew had tried to hold the woman down, and 2 of them got bitten doing it. And inside 20 minutes, those 2 crewmen were gray and sweating and biting too. And from there, it had gone through the enclosed lower passenger deck of that ferry like fire through a dry hayloft. Frances's voice stayed level the whole time she told it. Only her hands moved. They tightened on the gunwale, the knuckles going pale. And the captain, she said. The captain had understood what was happening while there was still time to do one useful thing. And the one useful thing he'd done was drive the ferry onto the rocks. On purpose. Aimed her at the nearest island and pinned the throttle wide open, because a grounded ship can't sink and can't drift out into open water. And running her aground gave whoever was still uninfected a high, dry place to climb to and lock a door behind. That was a good captain, Frances said. He knew exactly what he was doing when he did it. She didn't say what became of him. She didn't have to. She'd said was. So there was my first hard fact about the sickness. And I turned it over slowly. The way you turn over a heavy stone, you know you're going to have to lift. It moved by biting. It moved fast. 20 minutes from bite to sick was the number Frances gave me. And I filed that number away, and it never left me. And once it got into an enclosed space with people who couldn't get away from each other, it took everyone. That was why the 9 on the dock road had drifted so slowly and then turned so fast. That was why Dell had told me nobody's bitten before I'd even finished asking the question, because on that ferry a bite was a running clock. And every soul still breathing had learned to read the countdown in each other's skin. I looked at the 4 of them in my boat, and I did the thing I already hated doing, which was to run my eyes over their hands and their forearms and their necks, looking for anything wrapped, anything hidden, anything held too still. Frances caught me at it. She didn't take offense. She nodded once, a short approving jerk of the chin, and said, "Good. Keep doing that. Don't ever stop doing that." Bram had a windbreaker on with the sleeves pulled all the way down to the wrists. But it was a cold afternoon out on that water, with the sun getting low and the wind of our own passage over the open lake. And every one of us had our sleeves down. I noticed his sleeves, and I noticed that I'd noticed, and then I let it go, because there was nothing to do with the noticing. That was the first mistake. It was a small one. It would be a long while before I understood it was a mistake at all. And by then, it would already have finished its quiet work. If you've ever had to size up strangers, you're suddenly trusting with your life. Coworkers on a bad job, passengers in a stuck elevator, people at the scene of a wreck, then you know the exact feeling I'm describing. That quiet arithmetic you run behind your eyes on every face. Who's steady? Who's going to break? Who's telling you the truth? If a story like this is your kind of thing, stay with the channel. It helps more than you'd guess. 40 miles, at the speed that skiff could safely carry 5 adults and 6 coolers without swamping, was going to eat the rest of our daylight, and all of my fuel and probably then some. And I said as much out loud to all of them. I've learned over the years that the fastest way to lose a group of frightened people is to do all your thinking privately in your own skull and hand them only the finished decisions. People will follow you through a bad thing if they can see how you're steering. They'll fight you the whole way if they can't. Del knew boats, and he knew the island. And he leaned in low over the coolers between us and got specific with me, while Francis kept the other 2 settled up in the bow. Windigo. He said the West End station had a ranger residence, a small backcountry store, a proper dock, and, this was the thing he kept coming back to, a base radio that could reach the mainland and a float plane that put in there on occasion. If the sickness got to Windigo ahead of us, Del said, then we're running 40 miles to a second grave, and we should just find a quiet cove and wait it out. But if it didn't, if Windigo's clean, then that radio is the only telephone left in the whole world, and we point this boat at it, and we don't stop for anything. There's fuel caches, too, he went on, watching the shore slide by. Trail crew stashes. Malone Bay, middle of the South Shore. They keep gasoline there for the work skiffs. If we come up short, we top off at Malone. If Malone isn't overrun, Bram said. He said it from the middle of the boat without looking up from the coolers, and I noticed that too, that his eyes were on the coolers and not on the shore where the danger was. If it isn't overrun, Del agreed, quiet. And that was when Theodore spoke. The first words out of him in an hour. And they came out in a rush, low and shaking, his accent thick with the fear. The woman, on the ferry, the one who got sick first. He swallowed. Before she got sick at the dock, before she told people she was a nurse. She was going to Windigo, to work at the clinic, she said. And she said there was going to be a lot of sick people. She said it like she knew. He looked up at me, at all of us, and his eyes were wet. How did she know? Before she was even sick. How did she know there would be sick people? Nobody answered him. None of us had an answer to give. But the question dropped into the bottom of that boat with the coolers, and it lay there, and it did not leave. And it changed the temperature of everything. A nurse, traveling to a remote station at the end of the earth, saying there would be sick people before there were any sick people. It meant the sickness hadn't started on that ferry by chance. It meant the sickness had a schedule, and the ferry had run headlong into it. And I was carrying 6 coolers of vaccine to Windigo. I hadn't told them what was in the coolers. I want to be honest with you about that, because everything that came later runs through it. In 11 years of moving controlled medical cargo, you learn hard and early not to announce your load. A known load is a reason for otherwise decent people to make terrible decisions. So the four of them knew I had coolers, and they knew I sat close to them and kept a hand on them. And they did not know why, and I let them not know. And I told myself it was professionalism. It was partly professionalism. It was also, and I've made my peace with saying this, that I had begun to feel the exact shape of my own value in that overloaded boat. I was the man with the vaccine, running to the place with the sick people. And some old animal part of me, older than any training, understood before I'd have admitted it out loud that as long as they didn't know what I carried, I was simply the man with the boat and the local knowledge. And the man with the boat is a much harder man to leave behind on a beach. We ran west. The island unspooled on our left the whole way. Cliffs, coves, dark walls of spruce coming down to the rock, one empty bay after another. And all of it beautiful in the particular way a place is beautiful when it does not care in the slightest whether you live or die. The light went from gold to amber, to a long low bronze that laid a path across the water in front of us, like the lake was showing us the way. We passed the mouths of bays with campgrounds tucked into them, little docks and shelter roofs back in the trees. And at one of them, Chippewa Harbor. Dell named it. There were people out on the dock. And they saw us. They came to the very edge of the boards, right to the waterline. And they stood there and watched us pass with that terrible, unhurried patience. A whole row of them. Not calling out, not waving, just tracking us across the mouth of the harbor with their heads turning slowly in unison. "Don't slow down," Francis said very quietly. And I didn't. And I watched them in the corner of my eye until the point of land cut them off. And even after they were gone, I could feel them. Standing there at the edge of the water they wouldn't enter, watching the last boat go by. The light was nearly gone, and the sky over the west end of the island had gone the color of a cooling coal. When the engine changed its note. You feel that change in your teeth before your ears catch up to it, a small stumble in the steady rhythm, a hitch, a cough, and then the rhythm again, but not quite right. I'd been running that outboard hard for hours, and I knew what it was before I even looked down. And when I did look, the fuel gauge on the little tank confirmed it. We'd burned through what I'd been counting as our comfortable margin. Somewhere in the arithmetic of 5 adults and 6 coolers, I'd guessed the fuel burned too low. The spare gallon can lashed under the bow seat was the whole of our reserve now. And by my read, we had maybe 15 miles of water left to Windigo, and at the rate that overloaded hull was drinking gas, maybe 8 miles of fuel to cross it. Malone Bay was 3 miles ahead. The fuel cache. "We have to put in," I said. "We don't have the gas to make Windigo direct, not carrying this much weight." Francis turned and looked at the shore at the darkening trees, the black gaps between them, the specific and enormous danger of setting 5 people down on the one island that was busy killing everyone on it. And then she did the thing that made me trust her fully and for good. She didn't argue, and she didn't freeze. She said, "Then we do it fast, and we do it smart. Dell, you and Errol handle the fuel, you two move quick, and you don't talk. I'll hold the boat at the dock with the line in my hand and the engine running. Nobody goes up into the trees. Nobody goes past the shed. Nobody goes for a walk. We are on that dock for the shortest time it takes to move gasoline from a shed into a boat. And then we are gone." Bram said, "I'll come on the fuel run. 3 carries more than 2. We'll be off the dock faster." And that was true. 3 men moving fuel is faster than 2, and I said, "All right, fine, come on." And that was the second mistake, and it was a far bigger one than the sleeves. And unlike the sleeves, I have never fully forgiven myself for it, because Francis had drawn the plan tight and clean, and I was the one who loosened it. Malone Bay is a shallow, curved bite of water on the island's south shore, with a small floating dock, a ranger cabin set back 40 or 50 yards in the trees, and a fuel shed down near the shoreline, a lean-to roof over a rack where the trail crews keep gasoline in marked steel cans, the whole rack chained shut against bears and thieves. We came in slow, the engine barely turning over, all of us listening so hard I could hear my own pulse. The bay was silent. And I mean silent in a way that was itself a warning, because there were no birds. On a summer evening on that island, the shoreline should have been loud with them. The white-throated sparrows, the loons out on the water, the ravens. There was nothing. The island had gone quiet, and it had gone quiet recently. And quiet like that is not peace. Quiet like that is a room full of things holding still. We nosed the skiff up against the floating dock. Francis took a turn of the line around a cleat, quick and sure, keeping her weight ready to shove us off. Dell and Bram and I stepped up onto the boards, and the boards were solid and gray and weathered and completely ordinary under my boots. And I have never in my whole life wanted so badly to be back in a boat as I did standing on that ordinary dock. The fuel shed was maybe 40 yards up a short path from the dock. The cabin was another 50 yards past the shed, back under the trees, dark, and its door was standing open. I did not like that open door. You learn fast, in a place gone wrong, that an open door is a question, and questions are exactly what you can't afford to go around answering. We got to the shed, and the chain on the fuel rack was cut, not broken, not rusted through. Cut a single clean bite through one link, the bright, unweathered metal showing at the cut, the kind of cut a bolt cutter makes. Dell crouched down over it and touched the cut and said very low, "Somebody's been through here, and not long ago. Look how bright that is. That's a fresh cut. Rain hasn't even touched it." Most of the cans were still on the rack, but 2 were gone. Empty spaces on the shelf where 2 full cans should have sat. "Then somebody else made it this far," Bram said. And there was something in how he said it. That's good news. That means the crossing can be done. Somebody did it ahead of us. I lifted the nearest can off the rack, and it was full and heavy. The good, honest weight of 5 gallons of gasoline, and something behind my sternum came loose and unclenched. Because full fuel meant Windigo, and Windigo meant the radio. And the radio meant that somewhere out past all this water, there were still people who could pick up the other end. I turned to hand the can to Dell. And that was when we heard the cabin. It came from up the path, out of that open, dark door. And I'm not going to dress it up for you, because dressing it up would be a lie about how it actually was. It wasn't a moan, and it wasn't a scream. It was a wet, working, clotted sound. Several throats making it at once. Low, and under it the specific soft thunder of weight coming up off a wooden floor, of a number of bodies standing all the way up at the same moment. All of them woken by the small sounds we'd made, lifting the cans off the rack. I never got a clean count of how many were in that cabin. I never saw a single one of them clearly, and I'm glad of that, because the doorway was enough. The dark rectangle of that open door filled up, all at once, edge to edge. "Back to the boat," I said, and I want it on the record, for whatever a record is worth, that I set it level, because there is a version of that exact moment where a man's voice cracks and goes up, and everybody's legs turn to water, and they all die there on that path. And I did not let it be that version. and neither did Dell. We each grabbed a full can, and we went back down the path fast and controlled, not running blind, moving, and behind us the cabin came apart onto the path, that hooked forward-pitched run they do the instant they've locked onto a sound. And I'll tell you a thing nobody warns you about. It is faster than the drift. Much faster. The drift is what they do when they're waiting. The run is what they were waiting for. I made the dock. Dell made the dock a half step behind me. I swung my can over the side, and it landed hard on top of the coolers, and Frances already had the outboard turning over. The line half off the cleat, her whole body a coiled spring ready to shove us into open water. Dell landed in the bow. I put one foot on the gunwale and turned back to grab the dock line and cast us off. And in that half second of turning, I looked back up the path for Bram. Bram wasn't behind us. Bram was still up at the shed, and he had a can in each hand. 2 cans. He'd stopped to grab a second one, greedy, and it had cost him. The sick things were down the path now, out of the trees, and they were between him and the dock, a moving wall of them across the only path down. And there was no way on this earth for Bram to reach the boat, and no way for us to reach him without putting the whole loaded skiff, the vaccine, all 4 of us, inside the reach of a dozen mouths. Drop the cans. Go around through the water. Get in the water. Dell was on his feet in the bow, screaming it, because that was the answer. That was the one way out the water. They wouldn't come into the deep water. Go off the end of the dock and swim wide, and we'd pull him out past the point. And Bram looked down at the 2 full cans in his 2 hands, and he looked across the 20 yards of dock and water at us. And I watched a man make a choice with his whole body. He did not drop the cans. He backed away from us, away from the water, toward the cabin, toward the trees, and he shouted across the closing gap, one single thing that I've played back in my head 1,000 times since. At 3 in the morning, in the dark, trying to hear the lie in it that I couldn't hear then. Go. Don't wait. They'll follow the engine noise. It'll pull them off me. I'll go overland to Windigo go. And Frances took him at his word. God help all of us. She took him at his word, and I don't blame her, because it was a captain's logic, and she was a captain to the bone. The engine noise was the thing pulling them. Every second the boat sat idling at that dock was another second the sound drew more of them down. Bram had, in the space of one shouted sentence, made himself into a rear guard, a man staying behind of his own free will to buy the boat's escape with his body, drawing the danger onto himself so 4 others could get clear. And the captain in Frances heard a man volunteering to hold the line, and she did the only thing 40 years had trained her to do with an offer like that, which is spend the one to save the 4. Her jaw set. She opened the throttle. We came off that dock in a hard turn, the bow rising, and I got a last, clear look back. The sick things reached the end of the floating dock and stopped dead at the water's edge. Stopped like there was glass there, because they would not go into the deep water. And that was the 3rd hard fact, and it was the one that kept us alive more than once in the days after. They will not follow you into water over their heads. And behind that stalled wall of them, back at the tree line, I saw Bram Callister step into the black spruce with a full can of gasoline swinging in each hand, and he was moving fast. And he was moving well. And he was moving like a man who was not sacrificing one single thing. We had 2 cans of fuel in the bottom of the boat. He'd had 2 more in his hands when he walked into those trees. And I did not understand, not that night, not for another full day, that sur the outside that Bram Callister had not stayed behind on that beach to save us. He'd stayed behind to rob us, and he'd done it with a lie so noble, so perfectly shaped, that a 61-year-old ship's captain, who'd read every kind of weather and every kind of man, had thanked him for it with tears standing in her eyes while she drove us west into the dark. We made Windigo on fumes, in the last blue minutes of the light, and Windigo saved us and damned us in the very same hour. The West End station came up out of the dusk as a scatter of low, dark buildings around a sheltered inlet. The dock, the ranger residence, the little visitor store, an equipment shed, all of them unlit, all of them silent. But silent in a way that was different from Malone Bay. And it took me a moment to name the difference, and when I named it, my chest loosened a little. Malone had been silent like a held breath, like a room full of things gone still and waiting. Windigo was silent, like an empty house. And as we came in slow, Dell up in the bows sweeping a flashlight beam across the buildings, I understood which it was. There were no sick here, but there were no living here either. Windigo had been evacuated, recently and in a hurry, but a hurry that still had some order left in it, because whoever had cleared out of that station had done it well enough to close the doors behind them. Frances laid us alongside the dock as gently as if we were made of eggshell. 40 years of docking in her hands, and I killed the engine. And the quiet that comes down after an outboard has run in your ears for hours is an enormous thing. It has weight. In that first quiet, I could hear the small sounds of the inlet, water moving under the dock, and I could hear my own blood going in my ears. "Radio's in the residence," Dell said, keeping his voice low even now. "If there's still power to run it." There was power. That was the first mercy of Windigo, a diesel generator behind the residence, still running, its exhaust ticking warm in the cooling air, which meant somebody had fueled it within the last day or two before they'd gone, topped it right off, the way you do when you're leaving something behind that you might need to come back to. We went into the ranger residence together, all four of us shoulder to shoulder, because not one of us was willing to be the person left alone. In the dark outside, Dell found the base radio in a back room. A real set. A proper station with a whip antenna running up outside, and he powered it up. And the dials lit. And it worked. It worked. And that was the second mercy. And it was also the first minute of the end of us. Because the first voice we raised out of that radio was the mainland. It was Houghton. It was a Coast Guard petty officer whose name I never caught in the rush. And what he told us came fast and flat, and it took the floor out from under everything. The outbreak was not the islands. It was not local at all. It had started on the mainland. The ferry hadn't carried the sickness out to Isle Royale. The island had been one of the last clean places left in the whole region. And the Ranger 3 had brought the thing in with a single sick passenger boarding at Windigo from a Houghton that was already tearing itself apart. The nurse, Theodore, remembered to be the one who'd said there'd be sick people before there were any. She hadn't been predicting anything about the island. She'd been running to it, fleeing the mainland for the emptiest place she knew of, carrying the sickness in her own blood without knowing she carried it. The petty officer told us to hold at Windigo. He told us the station was a designated shelter point. He told us there was a resupply protocol, that the Park Service and the Coast Guard had set up a cold storage staging cache at Windigo for exactly this kind of medical emergency, and that a plane was coming for us, and that we were to secure the station and wait, and that above everything else, we were to protect any medical supplies present at the station. Because there was, in his exact words, a shipment of vaccine inbound to that location priority. Do you copy me? That shipment is priority. Dell turned and looked at me. Frances turned and looked at me. Theodore looked at me. I had 6 coolers of vaccine down in the boat. I had known for a full day that they mattered. What I had not known, until that petty officer said it into a hissing radio, was that they were the reason there was a shelter protocol at Windigo at all. Windigo was a designated shelter point because Windigo was where the vaccine was going. I hadn't been running a routine delivery to a little remote clinic. I had been the final leg of an emergency distribution that somebody on the mainland had stood up in the last hours before the mainland stopped answering its phones. And the ferry that was supposed to meet me and carry those coolers onward around the island had instead run itself up onto the rocks with a sick woman biting the crew in its lower deck. So I told them. A Sonarable was standing in that ranger residence with the generator ticking away in the dark outside and the radio hissing on the desk. I told all four of them everything what I was carrying. Why it mattered. All of it. I don't honestly know what I was expecting. Relief, maybe. We had the vaccine. We had reached the shelter. The plane was coming. By every measure, we had won. Francis did not look relieved. Francis, who had spent 40 years reading water and weather and the faces of men, looked at me. And then she turned her head and looked out the black window toward the east, toward the trees, toward the 40 miles of island we just crossed to get here, and she said, very quietly, one word. Bram. He went overland, Dell said. There's no overland from Malone. It's 15 miles of no-trail forest, crawling with those things in the dark. Francis, he's not walking that. Nobody walks that. He wasn't going overland, Francis said. And her voice had changed. It had gone flat and cold and strange. The voice of a woman doing arithmetic she despised the answer to before she'd even finished it. He had 2 cans of gas, 2 full cans. You tell me, why does a man walking through the woods on his own 2 feet need 2 full cans of gasoline? The room went very still. There were canoes at Malone, Dell said slowly. On a rack by the dock. I saw them when we came in. You don't burn gasoline in a canoe, Theodore said, very quietly from the corner. And there was a skiff, Dell said. And now he was moving toward the window himself, toward the dark glass. A trail crew skiff, under the lean-to next to the fuel shed. I saw it, and I didn't think one thing about it, because we had our own boat. He stopped. His face had gone slack. Small outboard on it, and 2 full 5-gallon cans is just about exactly what you'd want to run a small outboard the 15 miles from Malone Bay around the shore to Windigo. I understood it all at once then. The way you understand the shape of a thing you should have seen a full day ago, and somehow didn't. Bram Callister had not frozen at that shed. He had not been trapped there by bad luck. He had positioned himself. He'd volunteered for the fuel run, so he'd have a reason to be up on the shore. He'd hung back and grabbed the 2nd can on purpose, not out of greed, but out of plan. And when the cabin emptied out and the sick things filled the path between him and our boat, he had not been cut off at all. He had used them. He'd let a wall of the infected form up between himself and us, a wall we couldn't cross, and he was safely behind. And then he'd made himself sound like a hero staying behind to hold the line. And he'd shouted, "Go, they'll follow the engine. I'll come overland," and we had gone. He had sent us running west up the long curve of the shoreline, the slow way, the low-on-fuel way, while he took a faster boat and cut a shorter, straighter angle across open water with a can of fuel to spare and no passengers and no coolers to weigh him down. He had known what I was carrying. He was the one man of the 4 I had never told, and he was the only one who'd behaved. The whole crossing, like a man who already knew. I ran it back through my memory, and I found it. Plain as day now that I was looking. On the ferry, before I'd said a single word to anyone about the coolers, Bram had come down that ladder last and slow. And the very first thing his eyes had gone to was my cargo. And somewhere out on that water, quiet, he'd asked Dell what the courier was hauling, and Dell went gray in the face telling me this. Standing in that dark residence, Dell had answered him honestly. "I think it's the vaccine." That's the whole reason the plane comes to Windigo. Bram had known since Malone Bay that in a world where the vaccine was the only thing left worth having, whoever reached Windigo first controlled the only thing worth controlling. "He can't get here first," I said. "We have the coolers. He can't do anything without the—" "He doesn't need the coolers," Frances said, and she turned back from the window and looked at me with something in her face that was too close to pity for me to stand. "Think, Errol. Think it all the way through. What does the man with no vaccine do? In a world like the one that Coast Guardsman just described to us, he gets to the plane first, or he gets to the radio first and tells them to redirect it somewhere else, somewhere only he knows. Or—" And here her voice finally broke, one single crack in it. The only time in 3 days I ever heard Francis Okafor's voice break. "Or he gets here first, and he takes the plane, and he goes. And it is the only plane, and it is coming for us." The radio hissed on the desk. And then, faint, under the hiss, out of the black water somewhere to the east of the inlet, all 4 of us heard it at exactly the same instant. And I watched it land on each face in turn. The small, distant, absolutely unmistakable note of an outboard engine, running hard, coming in. Bram was maybe 10 minutes out. Here's the question I have never once, in all the nights since, been able to answer clean. And I'm going to put it to you now because you've been down in the bottom of that boat, with the 4 of us the whole way, and you've earned the right to weigh it. What would you have done, standing in that room, with 10 minutes on the clock and the only plane left in the world, inbound over the dark? I know what I decided. I still, to this day, do not know if it was right. The plane, as it turned out, was closer than Bram, but not by much. And the by much was the whole trap. Dell got straight back on the radio the second we caught that engine note on the water. And he raised the incoming aircraft directly a Coast Guard float plane, the petty officer's plane, running dark up along the Canadian side of the border. And its pilot's voice came back into that room, tired and human and real. 20 minutes out. He asked us to put a light on the dock so he could pick out the inlet and set down on the calm water inside it. He asked how many souls were waiting. Dell said, 4. And I watched Frances's face when he said it, watched something move behind her eyes and settle. 20 minutes for the plane. 10 minutes for Bram. That was the whole shape of the trap, laid out clean on the table between us. If Bram reached the station before the plane touched down, he would be standing on that dock when it landed. And there is no version of a man like Bram Callister standing on a dock beside a landing float plane, where he does not get on it. A float plane is not a ferry. It's a pilot and a small cabin, and at the outside, a few seats. 4 souls plus a load of coolers was already going to be a tight airplane. 5 was a fight over who flew and who stayed. And a plane sitting on the water is the most helpless thing in the world. It can't leave in a hurry. It needs the dock. It needs the light. It needs the water calm and the loading orderly. And every one of us understood in our bones that the moment those floats kissed the inlet, whoever was standing on that dock held all the leverage over everyone who wasn't aboard yet. Frances said, "We need him not to be standing on that dock when it lands." Flat, a captain again, spending the one to save the 4, except now the one had a name and a face, and had stolen our fuel with a lie so kind it had made her cry. "We are not hurting him," I said. I said it fast, before anyone else in that room could shape the next few minutes. I want that clear, right now, before we do anything. Whatever we decide, we do not put hands on that man. We are not that. Not for a plane, not for the vaccine, not for anything. We do this, and we walk away, able to live with ourselves, or we don't do it at all. Dell looked at me. "Then what?" he said. "Because he's coming, Errol. What do we do?" And I looked at the 6 coolers I'd carried across a dying island, stacked now on the residence floor. And I looked out the window at the generator exhaust ticking in the dark. And I looked at the radio. And I found the answer in the one thing I understood in that room better than anyone else alive did the cargo. "He wants the vaccine," I said. "That's all he wants. He doesn't want us. He never wanted us. We were just the boat. He wants what's in these coolers because in the world that petty officer just described, the vaccine is the only thing left worth being alive for. So we don't fight him for the plane. We don't try to beat him to the dock. We give him a reason to be somewhere else when it lands. Here is what we did. And I'm going to tell it to you plainly and completely, because I decided a long time ago that a man ought to be able to say out loud, in daylight, what he did in the worst 10 minutes of his life. We took one cooler, one of the 6, and we carried it out and set it down alone at the far end of the dock, out where the boards ran down into the black water. And we turned on the single dock light directly over it. Bait. In the open. Impossible to miss from a boat coming in off the dark lake. Then we went back and we killed every other light in the whole station, one by one, until Windigo was a black shape against a barely blue sky. And we took the other 5 coolers and we carried them fast up the dark path to the equipment shed, 200 yards back from the dock, and we stacked them just inside its open roll-up door. And Dell was good with his hands. I've told you that from the first rung of that ladder, Dell found the shed's own work light on its own switch. And he wired a length of line to the roll-up door's counterweight so it could be dropped from outside. And he left the light off. And then we went dark and silent in the residence. And we did the single hardest thing 4 terrified people can do, which is nothing at all. While an outboard engine out on the water grew from a whine to a growl, to a roar coming into the mouth of the inlet, Bram came in fast and came in confident. A man arriving at a place he had already decided in his own mind belonged to him. He put the trail skiff hard against the near end of the dock, and he was up out of it and onto the boards before it had even stopped rocking. And in the pool of that one dock light, we watched him from the black window as he saw the cooler. We watched him stop. We watched a man do arithmetic in real time. 1 cooler, alone, in a spotlight. No people anywhere. A whole station gone dark and dead quiet. An evacuated shelter with its doors closed. And I could all but see him building the story out of it. The story we'd built for him and left lying there to be found. A frightened group grabbed what they could carry and ran on up the coast in the dark. And in the panic of it, they left 1 cooler behind on the dock. It was a good story. We'd made it a good story. And it had exactly 1 flaw in it. A flaw that only a greedy man would ever step over without seeing. Which was that it required him to believe he'd arrived to find the single most valuable object left on Earth, sitting unguarded under a light, waiting for him. He went to the cooler. He crouched down over it. He worked the latches and threw the lid, and inside it was real. Real coolers, real dry ice rolling its white vapor up over the lip, real vials of vaccine, because a bait that isn't real doesn't hold a clever man for more than 1 second. And I needed this one to hold. And while Bram Callister was down on his knees on that dock with the cold vapor curling up around his hands and his face lit gold from below, Dell threw the shed light. 200 yards back up the dark path, the equipment shed lit up all at once. And in its open doorway, framed and stacked and gleaming under the work light, sat the other 5 coolers, 5 times the prize he was holding in his hands. And Bram Callister did the one thing the man who has already betrayed 4 people for cargo will do every single time you give him the chance. He looked down at the one cooler in his hands, and he looked up the path at the 5 in the light, and he chose the 5. He grabbed up the single cooler, and he came off his knees, and he ran up the path, away from the dock, away from the water, into the dark heart of the station, toward the shed and the 5. And Frances was already moving before he'd taken his second stride. She'd been a charter captain for 40 years. She could put a boat where she wanted it in her sleep. In the dark, half blind. The instant Bram cleared the dock, Frances was out the residence door and down the black boards and into his trail skiff, the fast one. The one with the fuel to spare, the one he'd stolen out from under us at Malone. Andel and Theodore and I went out the other way and down to our own battered aluminum skiff. And we cast off both boats and shoved out onto the black inlet, out past the reach of the single dock light, out into the deep, dark water where the sick things would not follow, and where a man on foot could not reach us. And we let the engines idle down to nothing, and we drifted, and we watched. Bram reached the shed. He went in through the open roll door, into the light, toward the 5 coolers. And the instant he was inside, Dell pulled the second line, the one he'd rigged to the counterweight, and the shed's heavy roll-up door came down behind him. We heard it hit the concrete. And then we heard him hit it, from the inside, the flat boom of a man's body against a steel door, once, twice, and then we heard him start to shout. We had not touched him. I want that understood. Still, after everything, after all this time, we laid not one hand on that man. We threw no punch and swung nothing at him. We built a room out of his own greed, and he walked into it carrying a cooler he'd chosen over 4 human lives. And the door that came down behind him was a door he'd have brought down on any one of us, without so much as a second's hesitation. And I know that for a fact, because he'd already used a lie on us on a beach that was worse than any door. The shed was built solid. It would hold him. There was a window high in the side wall he could break out through given enough time, but not quickly. And by the time he did, there would be nothing left on that dock for him to reach. The plane came in low over the black wall of the trees about 8 minutes later, running without lights. And it set down on the inlet in a long, white tearing rush of spray. And it slowed, and it swung, and it taxied up toward the dock. And its little cabin light came on warm and yellow in all that dark. The pilot leaned out his side window, and he counted us as we came up to him out of the darkness in our 2 boats, 4 souls. 4, with 5 coolers of vaccine stacked in the bottom of one of them. And behind us, faint over the burble of the plane's engine, carrying thin across 200 yards of dark from the equipment shed, we could hear a man shouting our names. All of our names, one after another. Shouting that he'd only been trying to help us. Shouting that we couldn't leave him there. Shouting that there were things coming out of the trees toward the shed now, drawn by the noise he was making, that the noise was pulling them in. That we could not just leave him locked into the metal box with the noise drawing them in out of the dark. And we could. That was the terrible arithmetic of it. Laid bare at last. We could just leave him there. That's the piece I want to finally hand over to you, because I've carried it by myself for long enough now. When the plane's door stood open and the vaccine was aboard and the 4 of us were counted and accounted for, the pilot tired, human, not knowing one thing about what had happened on that island. The pilot said he could take one more. There was one more seat. And a float plane sitting on the water is the most vulnerable thing in the world. But it can hold what it can hold, and it could hold one more. And 200 yards back, in a locked steel shed, a man was screaming our names into the dark, while the sound of him drew the sick things down out of the trees toward the walls that held him. and Frances Okafor looked at me across the strip of black water between our two boats, her face lit yellow from the plane's open door. And she said, "It's your cargo, Errol." It always was. "It's your call." She was right. It was my call. I was the courier. I had carried the load the whole way, from a dock at Rock Harbor, where 9 sick people turned toward the sound of my engine, all the way to this dark inlet at the far end of the world. It had always, in the end, come down to me and the load and the call. And I made the call. And we flew off that island into a world that was already ending everywhere else. And I have never once told a living soul which way I called it, not the pilot, not the debriefers on the mainland, not the people who ask me now, when they hear where I've been, how a courier got himself off Isle Royale alive. I'll tell you this much, and then I'll leave the rest of it where it lives. The plane held 4 when it lifted off that water. It had held 4 when it set down. You do that arithmetic whatever way your own conscience needs it done, because I've done it every way there is. And none of the ways of doing it lets me sleep. So let me leave it with you the way Frances left it with me, out there in the dark, on the cold water, with a vaccine between my feet, and a man's voice thinning out behind us. He lied to save himself, and the lie nearly killed all 4 of us on a beach at Malone Bay. He'd have taken that plane and flown off, and left every one of us standing on the dock without one backward glance, and we all knew it. But he was a man, and he was shouting our names into the dark. And there was 1 seat left, and there was, just barely, time. If you had been the one holding the cargo and the call, knowing everything I've told you, knowing exactly what he'd done to us, and knowing exactly what leaving him in that shed would mean on an island where the noise draws them in, what would you have done with that last seat? Tell me where you're listening from tonight. And tell me straight, because I've never been able to settle it for myself. Out there on that black water, with the plane running and a man screaming our names, did the 4 of us get it right? Because I still don't know. And I've had a long, long time in the quiet to think about it. And the quiet is the one thing that island gave to all of us that none of us ever managed to give back.